for some of the weekend seminars as well. And today we're talking a little bit about some of the anatomy and the biomechanics for one of the poses that gets done a lot in our public yoga asana classes, Chaturanga. So in the Chaturanga, what seems to be happening is a lot of folks are kind of tucking and rounding. And this is the round that I'm talking about. And when that happens, the shoulder tends to drop and the middle of the back tends to round up. And unfortunately, these aren't really the areas that we would like to have this downward and upward movement. These are much more passive. This rounding isn't related to a thrust, it's really just an arch of collapse. The dropping here that we see both in the shoulder and the middle of the cervical curve, both of those are also passive as well. We'll talk about what we would like to happen in just a moment. When this happens, a lot of different issues can arise, but probably the first and most noticeable thing will be a loss of strength and power. And the development that you get, and this is kind of like the effect of the work in the pose, the effect of the work in the pose will definitely not be a stronger, more stable axial extension. And that axial extension is going to be how the spine extends along its own column. Because over here, we're being passive and the spine is extending down this direction. You know, it's heading down here rather than extending along its own axis. And from our other coursework or lectures and seminars, that lack of axial extension becomes a big postural issue. It's natural, but it doesn't mean that it's desired or wanted. In fact, a lot of what we do on the yoga mat as far as body mechanics is to develop better axial extension and prevent, I think what we've brought up in some of the study work is what we call spinal creep. And that's the loss of axial extension, oftentimes related to muscle fatigue, postural fatigue, and stuff like that. And that's when we're going to get these exaggerated arches, which is very interesting because this hyperthoracic curve and hypercervical arch is that same kind of postural collapse that we're going to see in the spinal creep. We won't have the hyperlordotic curve in this. This will usually just end up being kind of a flat, sorry about that, a flat tucked bottom, and then the legs kind of droop as well. This is slightly exaggerated, but even a little bit of this drop here is going to have a huge effect throughout the entire body. And we're going to bring up one specific issue that is probably the most commonly dealt with if you do this a lot. So this is supposed to be our two lower arm bones. This is the radius and ulna. This upper arm bone here is the humerus. It's not too artistically written or colored in. This small kind of pie-shaped wedge up here is supposed to represent our scapula. And this little blue thing right here, this might help you understand the drawing more, since this was drawn a la Professor Ballenger's artistic endeavor. I do a better downward facing dog than I draw. So, this belly right here, this is where we're getting our bicep muscle. And this muscle could actually offer some support to this. It's not our biggest supporter to this entire action. In fact, when Chaturanga Dandasana is done really well, by the way, Danda is this root Sanskrit word for staff, and we don't want this collapsed, wavy staff. We want this really strong, extended staff. In Chaturanga Dandasana, as you collapse this down, what happens is the top of this bicep. This is where we have the bicep tendon, which comes up over the head of the humerus and comes back and attaches to the scapula. This is your bicep tendon. Top of the bicep, over the head, to the scapula. There's actually two heads to the bicep in there. They work a little bit different, but this is a good generality for right now. In the anatomy chunks, or if you're in one of the other courses or workshop sessions, and we go how to actually rectify the situation, we'll go into more of that. But this is some of the issues of why collapsing the shoulders down becomes such a big issue. So this bicep tendon, I just picked this up out of one of the other labs. I think it is on the right side. The bicep tendon comes from one of the two heads of the bicep muscle. There's two heads of it. And it comes right up over. You can even see one of the notches right here, up by the top of the upper arm bone. And it comes right up and over and begins to attach. It's not this long of a line. It attaches right up here. This is the scapula. It attaches right up here. So when we round this posture, number one, we destabilize the scapula. And by that, the scapula has most of its stability as it attaches towards the spinal column here. So it needs to attach to this spinal column. Some of the attachment comes all the way up the cervical spine, but it needs to attach. And whenever you round it like that, the scapula itself moves the direction of the head of the arm bone, which is even going to be farther away from the spinal column, which means we're going to have an unstable scapula. You're going to destabilize it this direction. It's loaded, which means this is very different than if you're standing and you just begin to slouch. To actually get in the Chaturanga position, now there is a lot more weight bearing into it. And as the head of the arm bone drops even farther in this direction, you're going to start to pull the head of the arm bone away from the scapula. So this is going to be this little part of the scapula that kind of wraps around. You can probably feel this in your own shoulder. That's the bony thing that you feel right there. To the front of that, there's a little hook in, and you can start to find your collarbone or your clavicle. So right around in here is where that bicep connects. So if I'm in a Chaturanga position, can't really do it, this thing's all anchored in, but if I'm in a Chaturanga position, this is actually pretty close. And I get way down low. The head of the arm bone is going to go that direction, down and forward. Like we might be able to accidentally tear this entire skeleton apart. Let's see if I can show you this a little bit better. You really don't want this to happen to you on your yoga mat. I will clean this up later. If you're my boss here at the college, don't worry, I know how to put this back together. So as the shoulder blade and the spine begin to round, the scapula moves away from the spinal column, which means that the muscles in here are being over-elongated. When we over-elongate a muscle, which you might think is fantastic stretching, but if you over-elongate a muscle and it's loaded, one of the ways it preserves its tissues is to essentially turn off the muscle contraction, which is not good for your posture because you either have to go back and turn it on or it essentially stays more off when you come out of the pose. So scapula moves away, rib cage rounds, and then the head of the arm bone continues to dip down because this is one of these points of force. This is where the arm, small amount of bone and muscle, begins to move down. This is one of the appendages. As your body weight thrusts that way, this is going to continue to try to drive down that direction. Which means that the more that you round, and even worse, the faster you do it, this head of the arm bone is going to tip down even farther. The bicep tendons, and I'll try to add a picture of this to the clip that we put up online. put a picture of this up online as well. If I don't, please don't get mad. You also have some bursa that are right in there and designed to give a little bit of cushion in the same area with the same anatomy. So you dive into that and the bursa can get inflamed. And whether you end up with a bursitis or bicep tendonitis, these are super common in folks who do this regularly, up tempo, repeated a lot, and that becomes a big issue. Oftentimes if I hear about a student who has that, I hear about it from somebody coming from a different class, practicing a different type of alignment and mechanics, and their doctor tells them to simply take a rest and a break, which doesn't change any of the mechanics. Take a rest, get the inflammation down, come back, perform the same mechanics, and it gets even worse. So, on to what I'm going to tell you is a little bit better. Without driving this down, you don't get this shearing force that happens. The shearing force is when you have these two different things essentially being pulled in opposite directions. Scapula, even though it's spreading away from the spinal column, has a lot of muscle between it and the spinal column, so it's resistant to round as much as the head of the arm bone. Head of the arm bone has a lot less tissue and a lot more force driving it down. So you have these two things separating, and that's the main thing that's in the way. One of your deltoids and that tendon. So over here with the spine more horizontal, more axial extended, which by the way is going to take a lot of coordination and muscular integrity. If this goes this direction, and you think about how this is set up, if you can imagine actually taking this scapula a little bit far back, a little bit more retracted, which is something we can engage on the way down in the chaturanga. If this scapula were a little bit farther back, and I hold this at a different angle, rather than farther forward and rounded, much bigger elbow angle, depending on a person's body. Sometimes we'll also hear about elbows that get inflamed or tendonitis or whatnot from their practice. So if I keep this more in this plane, then this bicep tendon could basically stay neutral. That's neutral. Then the elbow, boom, that's fairly neutral. If I take it and I tip this down even farther, eventually these are going to rotate in opposite directions, and my body mass is going to thrust these two to want to separate even farther. So if I hold the upper arm bone more in this horizontal line, then I also have a better ability to contract these scapular stabilizers all the way up to the head. This is a little exaggerated body length there. I can stabilize the scapula more. I can draw the scapula a little bit deeper on towards the spine, which is going to help with all this. If I have the elbows actually out far enough, in really hard, almost impossible. If the elbows are hugged all the way in, which is one of the directions that is taught for stability, it's to help stabilize by squeezing them in towards the ribs and essentially squeeze something not to drop it, versus putting the head of the arm bone at an angle that it articulates well with the scapula. Here's my part on that. If you remember our rotator cuff anatomy, part of the rotator cuff anatomy takes part of the rotator cuff from the top of the humerus and the head of the arm bone, and it laces it right underneath here. And it essentially attaches to this structure and this spinous process of the scapula. Another major part of that rotator cuff comes right over here and attaches scapula, spine of the scapula, a couple other muscles with the rotator cuff. If I hug this arm bone in too tight, I've basically over elongated this upper, that's above the spinous process, super, above or greater, spinatus. And if I over elongate that by hugging the arm bone in, it actually pulls origin and insertion away from each other. That muscle can barely support itself. And for some folks in their posture, begins to undertone or not do any of its work. So I destabilize the rotator cuff relationship. And if we go by our common concept of great muscular and joint efficiency in this 90-degree relationship, it's not true of every joint, but for a lot of them, it's really a great teaching tool. If I take the arm bone out approximately 90 degrees of the spinous process, my super and sub spinatus, or super and infraspinatus muscles are in optimal position to hug the head of the arm bone in towards its socket. It's not really a ball and socket, but in towards the joint structure in here. So, if I keep the torso up enough, if I keep the scapula stable enough, and if I keep the arm out enough, I have a really advantageous spot to hug the head of the arm bone to the scapula and the scapula into the spine. As soon as I break this round, I destabilize, even if I wanted to down here. Even if I had really developed muscles that can do this, as soon as I round it here, I lose the functional capacity to do it as well as I could here. So again, this isn't actually how to do it, that's in different workshop sessions, but the angles. You'd be much better off to simply stop on your way down. Stop halfway. Don't go near the floor. You should be up. Your throat, the base of your throat, the top of your throat should basically be just about as high as the top of your elbow, and your elbow should be more over your wrist, rather than having your elbow much farther back than your wrist, where you lose the thrust capacity, that's our angular work, to actually thrust and drive and hug. Yeah. Second to all that is the effect up here on the neck. We're actually going to continue to do this work where we overexert ourselves in one of these big cervical extenders or cervical arch extenders. We'll go through that in some of the other anatomy work. And then underactivate this other kind of partner muscle to these cervical extenders that goes all the way back, in between and in the range along the spine of the scapula. Here, we actually have the capacity. So, in addition to the shoulder stuff, scapular stuff, destabilizing and turning off muscles, wearing out this bicep tendon, coming down to a gentler angle, even if we can't perform all of the mechanics well enough, at least gives us the angles that we have the potential to actually engage this stuff. Strengthen these muscles if you can, even before doing the pose. By the way, if you keep this relationship and you were way up here, with your head way out here, right under our course number. If your upper arm bone was way up here, and you integrated this stuff well, you would begin the pattern, the neuromuscular, the proprioceptive, your motor map, all this pattern work. And if you engaged all of these same muscles to the scapula, held your entire body higher up to the hip, create a different hip angle, you develop all the right habits, all the right mechanics, and as those get strong enough, begin to challenge them more by coming down lower. At that moment that the head of the arm bone begins to round more forward, then either you haven't activated the right stuff, or you don't have the capacity to, and that's the sign, don't go there yet. Yeah. All right, so there's some of our chaturanga mechanics. Save your bicep tendons, develop better rotator cuff, scapular stability habits, and cervical arch extending habits. Those are the muscles that actually hold your cervical arch, rather than just having your upper cervical curve and a flat lower cervical curve, and actually function even better. Save your elbows, your wrist, and develop stuff that when you come off the yoga mat will actually help hold you up. And build it, develop it in a pose like this. It's a fantastic spot, great place to develop all these mechanics. If you head this way though, you can't expect to develop the same things that you're trying to develop here. If you head this way repeatedly, what you can expect to develop is the propensity to go here, 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 and then basically hang out. Doing this action and expecting this result doesn't make sense. That's not a karmic combination. This action doesn't result in these effects. All right. I'll save the rest of the lecture for later. It's good to see you all. Send me your comments. You can even write them on the YouTube clips if you would like. And I look forward to seeing you in class or in a workshop soon.